you know, it's not surprising. A few people are interested in how America pays for college. It's in the newspaper almost every single day. I wish it wasn't, but it is. Make my job a lot easier if it wasn't. We've read a lot about the $1 trillion in student loan debt. That particularly has been a fairly salient point. I mean, $1 trillion is $1 trillion, and given the time of year we are, and given the environment that we're in, people like to write about, people drowning in debt and terrible stories, and those are valid, real stories. I think distressed borrower stories are incredibly compelling, and how do we keep students and families out of getting themselves into trouble is a really important topic. But it's also really important that we look at the whole picture, and we make sure that we design public policies and pursue goals that are address the whole picture and not distort the picture. And so what I'm going to do today is, we've done a lot of research. We've been continuing doing this research on how America pays for college for about 5 years, where we actually ask families. This is the only place I know of that actually calls up families, parents and students, and says, well, how did you pay the bill? Not just how much did you borrow, not how much did you get in grant scholarships, but also how much did you pay out of your income and your sources of income and your sources of savings? And how much did you borrow from your relatives? And so it gives a picture every year of how families are meeting that cost of undergraduate education. We focus on that sort of traditional undergraduate population. But I think that's sort of a micro picture, right? I mean, it has macro implications, but it's a micro picture of how families our consumers are dealing with that bill. But I want to walk through some overview charts to sort of put the $1 trillion into perspective, what it is, what it isn't, what the investment in higher education is overall, and how much that's grown. And I think probably the primary, besides cost, the primary driver of the increase in spending on college is obviously a sizable and dramatic increase in the number of people going to school. And it was going on before the recession. It certainly has escalated during the economic downturn. If you can't find a job, you go back to school. So what we've seen is a huge increase in college enrollment, but particularly at the undergraduate level. And that fuels, right? That's more people going to school, more spending on college. That's fueling a big increase in borrowing overall. If we look, this is a, yeah. So I think demographically, I think we expected a big influx in the mid-2000s when we had the highest high school graduating class, and then we expected sort of to level off or come down. So I think where you see that pickup is probably more of the returning to school or making those choices. But there's also been, we have more people going to school straight out of high school than we have before. So it's not just the increase in college grads, it's the increase in number of college grads going on to college and the number of colleges they're going. So we're seeing a lot of that move into that population. So it's not just the economy, it's also people. It is a blanket federal policy that and sort of an accepted norm that people need to go on and get higher education, further their education. So people are driving themselves to that. And so, consequently, this is what we see for American spending for college. We pull this together from a lot of different data sources, but this is our best estimate on what families are spending on college. And you can see that over the last 15 years, what we've found is families have spent $3.7 trillion approximately on education. And it's grown substantially, and it's across all levels. Borrowing is a good part of that. That's the federal and state loans is that green share down at the bottom. Grants, you can see, have increased a lot, and families' contributions, what people are spending out of their income and savings, still funds the most. This is both graduate and undergraduate, so this is mixed in. It'll be a little bit different when I get to undergraduate by itself. But $3.7 trillion over 15 years. So So about a quarter of it's funded through borrowing, and student loans are different than most consumer loans. They pay off over a very, very long period of time, generally 10 years or more. We have, actually at Sallie Mae, we have about 60% of our federal loans that we own are consolidation loans, which have a very, very long life, 20 years or more. So people are paying back their loans over a very long period of time. So if you look at about $3.7 trillion, a quarter of it funded by borrowing, $1 trillion is not that surprising a number, right? It represents what students and families have borrowed over the last 15, 20 years to invest in themselves to further their goals of higher education. So that, I mean, it is not a surprising number. I think what a lot of people are surprised about is really what it's composed of. If we look at the $1 trillion of student loans, where is it? Well, we have Sallie Mae and others are in the business of providing private education loans to fund the gap between federal loans and other forms of college assistance and the total cost of attendance. But it is a small portion of where the $1 trillion is. We look at where the $1 trillion in student loans are. It's primarily federal. At the end of last year, it was about $850 billion. And probably at the end of this year, it's going to be nearly, well, it'll probably be nearly $1 trillion. At the end of this past fiscal year, I'm expecting we're going to come in, the federal loans will be about $1 trillion in outstanding federal loans in total. So when we talk about, so really when we're talking about, just this is a little aside, in terms of a housing bubble, is it similar to mortgages? It's not. These are not, most of these loans, this is not a securitization issue. This is, there's an issue here at all, and I think there are issues within this, but it's not an overall issue. But if there's an issue, it's a fiscal issue, because the federal loans are either owned, half of them now or more are owned by the federal government, the rest are guaranteed by the federal government, so, and that portion is declining. So that's where we see, that's where the $1 trillion is. And really, if we, just to drill down a little bit more, where is this coming from? Well, post-credit crisis, we have two types of loans. There's either federal loans that are made by the federal government, or there's loans that are made without federal backing at all. The private education loan market is pretty small. It's about $7 billion last year. Yeah, go ahead. Well, we do. So Sallie Mae today is a private education lender. We service loans for the federal government, the loans that are owned by the federal government. We are one of the large 4 servicers for them. And then we also own, we probably have the largest, we do have the largest portfolio of older federally guaranteed loans that we own and service. We also are more than just a lender. We are the largest administrator of 529 plans in the country. UPromise is a subsidiary, so we are the largest planning, saving, and paying for college company in the country. So our role, our market is higher education finance, and we help people look forward to pay for college. We are the back office. We are the largest back office for 529 plans in the country. Right. Right. So and so, where are we originating loans today? We're in the blue line that we do those loans, but we're not originating the red lines anymore. Yes. We originate private loans that are not federally backed. So, but that's, as you can see, a fairly small market. Last year was $8 billion. So that's a relatively small market compared to the $105 billion that was originated by the federal government last year. So when we read articles about all consumer credit, during the credit crisis, most consumer credit contracted, and the only consumer credit that actually expanded were student loans. You have to actually drill down below that, and we can see that private loans, non-federally backed loans, contracted, but what really increased were the federal loans and what were on the federal book. And from 08, 09 through 11, 10, almost all of those loans are owned by the federal government. So there was a big expansion in that lending in that year. And that was partly driven by enrollments, but also by increases in loan limits. They're actually borrowing more from the federal government than they did in previous years. So, but when we look down, so enrollment has gone down. I think College Board does a pretty good job of tracking average borrowing. And they had their latest report come out last week. And so this is the average debt for a college grad at a four-year public school and a not-for-profit school. And this is adjusted for inflation. So we can see that the average debt, and the blue line is per borrower, so those who borrowed, what the average debt was, and then the red line is across all bachelor's degree recipients, which I don't think is actually necessary. But what's important here, and what you can't see, but you can go online later and pull up the chart and see yourself, is what's kind of remarkable, I think, is that the percent of bachelor's degree recipients who have borrowed at some point in their college career has been relatively constant over the last decade. For four-year publics, it's about 57% of college grads have borrowed at some point during their year. And for a private not-for-profit college, four-year college, it's gone up slightly from about 63% 10 years ago to about 66% last year of college grads borrowed at a four-year not-for-profit. And the amount of borrowing has gone up, but at a relatively modest pace, at about 2% a year above inflation. That is an increase, but it is not sort of the dramatic, what we read about in the papers quite so much every day. So there is an increase in borrowing, but it's still, it's in the $25,000 to $30,000 range right now for college grads. Here's the most important thing, I think, borrowing. And this is, I think, a challenge for everyone in the field of financial literacy, frankly, is the value of getting that degree. A borrower who gets a degree is far less likely to default than if they don't get the degree. If they go to college for 2 years and borrow to do that and drop out and never go back and finish their degree, they're 4 times as likely to default than if they actually finish their degree. So really, this is research that was done by the education sector. They put out a report called Degreeless in Debt, and which is a terrific study, but it really shows the value of that degree. And I have some we're going to look at employment in a sec, but just another chart that they showed is the increase in dropouts and what that means. And across all sectors, public 4 years not so much, but even not-for-profit 4 years, we've seen an increase in the number of dropouts. So students are going to school, they're trying higher education, and then they're for whatever reason dropping out and not finishing their degree. That puts them at great risk of defaulting. Right. I mean, this was taken from the Department of Education database on tracking students from early in the 2000s through 2009. That doesn't mean they didn't go back later. So here's the value of a degree for a young person. And this doesn't mean that you're not underemployed, but we get data from the Department of Labor on 20 to 24-year-olds and their unemployment rates. And we've been tracking it for a while. And, obviously this is a big deal, right? The top yellow line on the chart on the left is the unemployment rates for 20 to 24-year-olds compared over through the recession, and you can see it has definitely gone up for college grads, but not to the extent that it's gone up for those people who have a high school degree or less. That their unemployment rate is about 20%, and that's just their unemployment rate. When we look on the right column, which I think is even more important, is this is a chart together where we look at everybody that's not enrolled, but that means they could have dropped out of the workforce. And if you look at those 20 to 24-year-olds who have no college experience, so they have a high school degree or less, they're only 6 in 10 are employed at all. I mean, 40% are either unemployed and looking, or they're just not in the workforce at all. And as you go across the bottom, and I don't know if you can read that, but getting some college experience helps, but getting a degree really helps. If you have an associate's degree, and particularly if you have a bachelor's degree or more, you are far more likely to be employed and in the workforce than you are if you have not gone to college at all. So it's incredible. This is just 20 to 24-year-olds. So you may come out and you may be there has been some research about underemployment, but I think frankly, the notion that this is one of the true testaments to the value of college is that you are able to get a job, and that I think one of the real challenges in looking at whether you should borrow or not is that mismatch of when you come out of college, you have the debt, but you're not going to make $100,000 a year the minute you walk out. You're probably not even going to make $60,000 a year. So how do you manage that mismatch? Your education, is it going to accrue value to you over the life of your life? And by and large, the investment that you've made in higher education is going to pay off over time. But how do you manage that mismatch of coming out of school and making sure that you get a job that can pay that debt? And that's a real challenge for anybody that's in the higher education finance area. So let's see where I am in this. So one of the other things I think is important is that is to look at not just the young college grads, but Georgetown did some great research on the value of a bachelor's degree. This is from their research they put out, I think earlier this year, called the College Advantage, Weathering the Economic Storm. And the green line shows you the employment change for those with a bachelor's degree or better. The red line is those with an associate's degree or some college. And the blue line is those with a high school diploma or less. And you can see the recession hammered. And as we saw for young college grads, slide before, clearly recession hammered high school degree or less. Anybody who has a high school degree or less, the recession hammered these people and they have not recovered. Where we have seen recovery is in those with some college experience or an associate's degree. The people who weathered the storm the best were the best educated. They've made it through. That's where the job growth has been for bachelor's recipients. So it's a pretty powerful study. I'd highly recommend it to take a look at. And so Rutgers put out some research too on recent college grads. They surveyed college grads who had graduated in the last 4 years, since 2006 through 2011. Some of this is a glass half full or glass half empty. So I think a lot of the report was a glass half empty, but I actually found a lot of surprising things in the study that went counter to even my expectations. The pie chart on the left, on your left, they asked these young grads what was their progress in paying off their debt, and really surprised me that 13% had reported they paid off all their college debt, and that another 13%, so fully a quarter, had paid for half or more. So they've just graduated since 2006. They have paid half or more of their college debt, and one quarter had paid about half had paid about one quarter, and only 28% had paid less than one quarter. And some of these are students that went back to school and deferred their debt while they were in school. So So these are not people that are out in the workforce completely. A lot of students had gone back into the workforce. So, I sent this around to, people who look at our data and internally about just the, the normal, if you were just to pay from the day you went out and how much you would expect to pay down, that these numbers are actually better than what we would traditionally expect on a 10-year repayment note. So we thought that was fairly actually positive news, that people were actually paying. Lots more people are paying off their debt. It is what we experience in our own loans, is that when we look at our private education loan portfolio, 87% of our loans are current. That means people are making payments and they're on time. That's shocking, right? And in our older federal loans portfolio, it's less, but it's not that much less. I mean, it's in the and I just don't have the numbers on my database, but we have, so the vast majority of students, graduates, borrowers are paying their loans on time. That's not really the most compelling stories in the world, but I think it's important to keep in perspective as we work through other issues. The chart on the other side is they ask these young grads, what's your confidence in the next 10 years you're going to be able to do many of these life's achievements, like be able to buy a home, be able to start a family, have a job where earn enough to lead a comfortable life. So these are big markers. Again, 28% say they're already there for buying a home. That just is surprising to me. They must have stellar credit. But they are also a pretty darn optimistic bunch. So half report that they are either there or already there in buying a home, being able to start a family, having a good job. Those are not quite they're not perfect statistics, but they are certainly more promising than what we read about a lot of times. Not paying for college yet. Am I paying college? So that's sort of that's my overview on the big picture. What I'm going to do now, I have a lot of slides on how America pays for college, so please ask me as I go through them. I love this research project. I've been working on this the entire time. It was my hope and dream for a long time, and what I'm pleased about is that we've been able to do it and continue to do it every year, because we did our 5th year this year, and it provides great information on just sort of how families have weathered the economic recession, how they meet the college bill, and I think we found some really interesting findings. What we do is well, let me tell you a couple things about this. I want to tell you what the survey is not. We don't look at older students. I think that's probably actually, in terms of student loan issues and borrowing issues, I think there is issues there for returning students, and I think we need to probably look at that too. But this is not older students. These are the more traditional 18 to 24-year-old students. We're interviewing the students, and we're interviewing their parents. There has been a lot of change in higher education, and there's been, where we see a huge influx in college attendance is really at the community college, so we probably don't pick up all those we don't get that returning adult. So this is not going to tell you much about that. I think it's an important population. I think it deserves a separate study at some point. So we're looking at 800 college students. We talked to 800 college students, 800 parents of college students, 18 to 24 years old. It is more of the traditional population. And so what there are two sort of paths that we look at in paying for college. One is how they actually pay. So we go through all the sources and ask them how much to spend. And then we actually ask them a series of questions about how they feel about this really important investment. I think I just talked about a lot of that. I don't really care. So I'm going to walk through the values first, which I think are remarkable, and particularly remarkable given the period of time that we're going through. One of the amazing things to us, and I mean, I think it's a good thing, is as when we ask families, and we, the students and parents, do you agree with these broad statements? College is an investment in my future. I'd rather borrow than not go. I'm willing to stretch myself financially. A degree is more important than ever. There is incredibly strong agreement with these statements, particularly the investment in the future. And I think that's important for colleges and universities to keep in mind that this is a value statement. Families believe that this is an investment in the future, and it's been able to remain strong, right, throughout a fairly trying period. 98% last year either agreed or strongly agreed, and the blue is strongly agree. So this is not a weak agreement. This is strong agreement, 98% that it's an investment in the future. You know, this is why people are going to college. This is why they stretch themselves to get there. This is why this issue is so important. This is colleges. The value of college by these people who are there making the investment. They hold these values strongly, and they have not weakened much at all over the last 5 years. If we look at students, we can see they definitely, we've had some noise going up and down, but these are strongly agree. Okay, I've taken out the agree. This is strongly agree. Students are as willing to stretch themselves 6 out of 10. They'd rather borrow than not go. 90% of students are strongly agree it's an investment in their future, and that hasn't changed. It's actually increased in the over the last 5 years. It's more important now than ever. And students would attend for the experience despite their future earnings, which is that's not a huge agreement. It's actually interesting. This is that one is people agree, but they just don't agree this strongly. The one place that people in higher education should probably be aware of and look at is in the parent area, because, and this is going to be reflected in the spending too, I think. You'll see in a few minutes. Parents are, they're willing to stretch themselves, but not quite as much as they were a few years ago. And again, these are strong agreements. So if you look at the total agreement, it's about the same. It's a shifting in sentiment, right? It's just not as strong as it was. So even in investment as a future, parents still agree or strongly agree at about the same level as they did a few years ago. But what we saw this year is just a slight weakening from strong agreement to just agreement in the investment for the future. It's still a huge number, but it's just not quite as strong as it was in previous years. That's same with borrow than not go and willing to stretch financially. The one where we've seen a real drop, significant drop, is whether parents are willing to pay for college for their son or daughter to go to college to attend for the experience despite their future earnings. They're just they're not into that. That's I mean, it's kind of a dramatic drop. Not a surprise there. One of the things that we've really seen, we asked families at various points in the application process, did you consider cost when you were selecting schools to apply to? Did you consider cost when you were looking at the financial aid package? Did you consider cost when you were making your final choice? And then we added up as to did you consider cost at any point in choosing college? And that's where we actually see this is a trend, and it's been a gradual trend over the last 4 years. But this is, I think, one of the places that the economy is showing up in our research is that families are becoming more cost conscious, and they are considering costs at more points across the process. 4 years ago, it was less than 60%, and now we're nearly 70%. So it's gradual, but it is a shift. And what I think you'll see in a few seconds is that you'll see that shift in actually their spending patterns as well. Spending patterns is next. So actually, this is where you're going to see it. So this is how we take let me just tell you our methodology first. We look at, we get all this information from families, and they give us all the sources, how much we actually ask them to give us the number of how much they spend on from each source. And then we add it up, and our researchers do some machinations, and we come up with an average amount that the families spend on college, if you average across all families. And then we can look at it at different levels, low income, middle income, and high income. The red line is all families, and you can see this is, you can see the sort of gradual increase the first 2 years of the survey, and then the economic recession really hit, when did it hit? It hit the end of 2008, 2009. People were already in school in 2008. Recession's really hitting in 2009. The families made we kind of actually expected people to spend less in the academic year 2009-10. What we saw was a substantial increase. What parents and families did is that they reached, this was a reach year for families, and they spent a lot more on colleges and universities than they did in the previous year at the onset of the recession. A lot of reasons, we can only speculate as to the reason. One of the reasons, I think, is that a lot of times college decisions are made in the spring for the fall, and you think this is going to be short term. So you make your decision, you go to school, and then you don't have time to make, you really don't have as much time to make adjustments. What we've seen since then is that the spending has gone down. Families are taking cost into consideration, and they are spending less on school every year, and that's been brought down. And that's been pretty much, that's not quite what the low income is, but overall we're seeing a decline in the spending on college. And how can that be when tuitions are going up? And nobody's asking me that, but I'm going to answer it anyway. And so this is what this is what families are spending, right? It's not what the tuition bill is. So families are making, they're cost conscious, they're making choices within this process to spend less. And how they do that, they're shifting their choices. 2 years ago in this research, we saw a big shift at two-year schools. From 22% of our students surveyed were at two-year schools up to 29%, and that stayed this year. But the other thing is that once they make the choice, they're also choosing within categories less expensive schools. And then within that, once they make their choice, they're finding ways to spend less. So for example, one of the big differences that we saw is that they are just finding ways to save money. And one of the big ones is we saw a huge shift in students living at home. And I think the overall number was a shift from 44% last year lived at home to 51% this year. But where the real shift happened was in the high income families, and that's 2 years ago, 24%. So low income families and middle income families, pretty much about half have lived at home in our survey for the last few years when we asked that question. Yeah. I think it's just that's our explanation of what's happening within that. It's if you look at how, so they're making choices to be more cost conscious. But when 1,600 is great for a lot of things, but it's not great to be able to look at sort of those classes of schools below that. We don't have a big enough database to really analyze that.
Do you know how much these accounts for the election costs?
We don't ask about the bill, about room and board, and we don't ask what they're spending on. We just ask where they're spending it. We ask their sources. How much are you spending from these various sources? So I don't know. But so you have to really, when you go through the report and you read the report, you come up with a story of how this is working. So that's our it certainly feels that way. It looks like that. And there's actually throughout this, and I haven't highlighted it here. But if you read the report, which is at www.salliemae.com/How America Pays, you can get the report yourself. And one of the things you'll see is this sort of theme through this is in the higher income families. And higher income is, we're using what the what our research firm tells us we have to use, but higher income is classified as over $100,000. So low income is below 35,000, middle income is 35 to 100, and then high income is 100 and over. And what we're seeing, you know, certainly when you live in Washington, D.C., probably 100,000 doesn't feel like high income, but what we've seen, and we see it through the data, is these are the families that are making more than they're making more than they're over the cutoff for a lot of financial aid, so they don't get the Pell Grants and they don't get some of the other aid, but they're the ones where we see a growth in borrowing. It's in this income level. Where we saw the living at home, it's in this income level. That's where we've seen the bigger shifts this year. Where we saw, and I'm going to, a shift in share of who's paying for college, that's where we saw the shift. Wasn't so much in low income. They've been dealing with this a long time, and they pretty much are paying for college pretty much the same way they've paid. They're getting a little more in grants than they were. It's really in this higher income where we're seeing shifts between parents and students that we didn't see before. So living at home, we were sort of struck by, particularly by this high income group. We found that more families were taking other cost saving measures to bring the cost down. So I think overall what we saw is the value was high, but their families are just trying to figure out ways to make it work and spend a little bit less. This is another way we look at it. There are a couple ways you can look at cost. So we do this composite. This is the $21,000. It's broken down by source. How did families pay for? What does it look like this year? We've been doing the same pie chart, same colors, because I like the colors, for the last 5 years. And what we see is, this is the. And let me just caveat this. This is the average family, right? And we all know right here, right now, there is no average family. Nobody probably does it exactly this way. It's an average across all families. And we can break it down in a lot of different ways, by low income, middle income, high income, and that will look different. But it's just useful to know that this is sort of when we look at how undergraduate education is funded, parents are the biggest funders of college education. They pay for about 28% through their income and savings and another 9% in borrowing. That percentage has decreased over the last 5 years, 4 years. They paid, when we started doing this research, they funded about nearly half, about 47%, through either income savings or borrowing, and that has come down. I think that's partly because, I just think that's a shift in income, right? Families don't have as much income as they did previously. Another shift has been in grants and scholarship. When we started doing this, it was about 25% of college costs were paid for by grants and scholarships. Now it's up to 29%. Friends and relatives has been about the same. And then there's student income and savings. And that has gone, what we've seen is a shift there too, is that we've seen the cost spending down, but within that smaller pie, students are responsible for a bigger share than they were in previous years. They were up to 30% of college costs last year. When we started doing this, they funded about a quarter of college costs. Let's see, this is another way to look at it. This is the pie turned up and then looked at over time, so you can see how it's changed. And And the numbers are very small, but you can kind of get an idea. The left-hand side is the average amount, so that's the number, the dollar amount, and on the right is the share, so you can get a sense of the percentage. And you can see that's where you see that. See the dark blue line? See, I'm pointing here like you should be able to know what I'm doing here. Someone told me there's a pointer here. There it is. Okay, I can try to do this. So this is what I just talked about, was this 36 and 9. That's parent contribution, is the big blue. And it is still a big blue line, right? I mean, that's still, parents are shouldering the biggest share. But that was 36 and 9 we started doing this, and now it's, I can't read that far away, but that's 28, 37% compared to 47% when we started doing that. So you can see that shift. Now, but if we look over here, if we look at the dollar number, which you really, can you read, particularly you in the back, can you read that? Just take my word for it, the number is the same. Here and here is the same number. So parents are contributing about the same amount they did 4 years ago. They're borrowing about the same amount as they did 4 years ago. Here's what the big shift. They reached into their pockets. They spent a lot in right after the first year recession. And since then, they brought it back down. They've managed it. They really, what we talk about is they really broke that piggy bank, right? They reached into every single pocket. They did some good things. They did some probably not some good things. We saw an increase in borrowing from or using their 401ks. Not really a great plan. And so we see some recovery there, but that's, but they've brought that number down. But because the dollar level is higher, their share is lower. What else happened here? This is another, so what we saw then is in grants and scholarships, part of this is an increase in Pell Grants, and part of this was an increase in scholarships, huge, big shift in scholarships this year. And when we saw this happen, we sort of anecdotally knew that colleges were upping their scholarships to try to keep people in seats. And we wondered aloud, with the endowments where they were, was that sustainable? And this drop is from scholarships. So indeed, it was not sustainable. Colleges and universities were not able to sustain the level that they raised. It's still higher than it was, but that's largely because of the increase in federal contributions. Yeah.
So I have a question about the increase or something in 2009, 2010. So I know your data doesn't go back, but should we think of it as like continuation of like the growth rates that have been going on for a while? Because it's really hard to understand why going into the recession that they like ramped up like that.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we'd been doing it longer and we could actually see that total trend here, whether it was sort of came in like that. But it is definitely, we saw this pretty big increase, right?
Do you know how that's spent, like how much of that tuition?
We don't ask that question. But we, and one of the things that we do, this is how much they spend. We ask them what their bill is as well. We don't ask the components of the bill, and I don't have that in here. But the bill is always less than what they spend. And frankly, with a college freshman, I now know why. Because there are lots of expenses that are not as part of that budget that you think, and you actually end up spending a lot more on college than you're actually planning for. So that's what we see. I mean, so we're seeing, parents still funding a good share of it, but it's come down over the last few years. And students, again, have picked up the share. It's not dramatic, but we are seeing increasing share from them. So this is what we call our composite of how America pays for college. It's sort of an average across all families. In our research in the Paying for College report, you can see it by college type. You can also see it by income level, which is what I talked about a few minutes ago. Low income is very, very different than high income, obviously. Low income, student borrowing, it really looks like students pay for and are responsible for a much bigger share of their college education than those in the middle class or the higher income. Interestingly, when we talk about this shift in parents, we have seen parents in low income reporting that they are picking up more than they did in previous years. Over the last couple of years, they're picking up a greater share than they did before, surprisingly. Where we see the shift in between parents and students is in that over $100,000, that higher income level. We saw a pretty interesting shift there, and that's probably the families that are getting squeezed more. And if you just give me a second, I'm going to look it up because, and I'm going to have to put on I don't have to put on my glasses. So in the high income families, 4 years ago, parents picked up 61% of the cost of college through their borrowing or savings. And students picked up only 14% of the cost of the college. What we've seen last year is that students paid 23% of the cost, and parents dropped their share to 52%. So that's really, the middle income didn't shift that much, the lower income didn't shift that much, but the higher income, that's where we saw the big shift. So that's where, again, that's where we're seeing changes. And interestingly, and I think I don't know that I have it, I do have that chart, so I'll get to that in a second, is in terms of borrowing, the increase of use of federal loans, we saw a fairly significant increase in borrowing, those families, students borrowing, but it was not in the low income and middle income. That's been fairly constant. It's been in the higher income students, over $100,000, where a few years ago, 2 years ago, 16% of students over $100,000 income reported borrowing. So it was 16%, and last year it was 27%. So it went 16% up to 19%, and last year 27% of students in high-income families borrowed federal loans, which is a fairly big shift. So the composite is one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is then as you look at how frequently people use various sources, not just with the average sources, but the frequency with which people use sources. And that's another place where we've seen another change, whereas in the first couple of years we did this research, parents' contributions from income and savings were used most frequently to pay for college. They're still a major contributor, but grants and scholarships are used more frequently today than they were before. So this year we saw 61% of families, students, and parents reporting that part of their college was paid for by a grant or scholarship. That doesn't mean that it paid for all of the college, right? We don't have that many people that have actually a full ride from a grant or scholarship. Well, and in the overall numbers, we see that it only pays for 29%. But there is a great frequency of use, and it shifted up considerably 2 years ago, and or in the previous year, and we think that's largely because of the shift in Pell, but also from colleges and universities stepping up. And then that drop from 67 down to 61 was really a drop in scholarships, not grants. Half of students contribute their own income savings. About a third of students borrow in any 1 year. And how does that correlate? So students don't borrow every year. They borrow some years. If you get a college degree, then two-thirds, 57 to 67% have borrowed to get a college degree, but that doesn't mean they've borrowed every year. And these also include students that are going to community colleges, so that changes that as well. So the frequency is important way to look at this. I have just a couple more things, and then we can go into questions. It's really to focus on borrowing. I want to give you a couple. When we look at borrowing, one of the things we like to look at is, again, is the percent of students that are borrowing in any one year. And this is pretty consistent with what College Board finds, is that about a third of students borrow in any one year. And then we look at what they're borrowing. And we have, so 35% of students borrowed last year. Most of them borrowed a federal loan only. Another significant percentage borrowed both a federal loan and a private education loan. And only 1% of students actually borrowed a private education loan without getting a federal loan, which is pretty consistent with what we see in our practice, because students are encouraged through school certification and through disclosures on private education loans to apply for federal loans first. And we've actually seen a greater percentage of students doing that than we did prior to some. There's been some significant reforms and disclosures for what people see on private education loans. So we think that has a pretty big impact on this. And one of the big impacts is on families filling out the FAFSA. This is an important tool that families have. That this is the free application for federal student aid, and families have to fill this out if they want to get federal loans or Pell Grants, or and many colleges require it for any type of financial aid. So as you can see, this is across students, but we see 8 out of 10 families fill out the FAFSA. When we look at just private education loan borrowers, interestingly, we have almost, it's like 98% of private education loan borrowers have filled out the FAFSA. So that's why we see, I think we see such universal use of, if you have a private education loan, you're probably likely to have a federal loan as well. And here's just, this is what the average amount borrowed. This is the federal use, the federal student loan use, and you can see that increase over the last few years. And this is really, particularly last year, the percent of families using federal student loans was really driven by that income level of families with income over $100,000. But you could see that we're seeing a big shift in both the borrowing there. That this is, again, this probably mirrors, this is the micro level, it mirrors what we're seeing on the macro level, which is an increased use of federal student loans and increased borrowing by that, which is reflective of loan limit increases. So I've been all over the place on this. I think we also ask families about how they plan for college and plan to pay for college. And I think this is probably, for financial literacy people, this is probably one of the major takeaways, is that families don't actually have a plan to pay for college. We ask them, do you agree as to whether you have a plan to pay for college? And the overall number is 39% of families report that they have a plan to pay for all the years of college to attain that degree. And that's, I think, the real challenge. So the percentage of students that took loans to get a degree, that's flat. Whether somebody takes a loan in a year has been actually, that is going up a little bit. So, and the amount that they're borrowing is going up, which is also reflected in that chart as well. So that, the chart previously was just bachelor's degree recipients. So I don't have associate degrees and things like that. Let me talk, but planning for college is, this is one of those really, I think, hard questions in financial literacy, is how to get families to plan for all 4 years, because it's a pretty scary prospect, right? So 4 in 10, even in the high income group, you know, it's 57% of families say they have a plan to pay for all 4 years. Well, that's great, but that's 4 out of 10 don't have a plan. And the worst thing students can do is to get into college, go for a couple of years, borrow for that investment, and decide halfway through that they can't do it, that they can't pay for it, and they drop out. You can see from the previous, when we were doing those charts on employment, what the value of education is getting that degree. It's not just the degree, it's not the piece of paper, it's the education that represents, and that degree has real economic power, it has employment power, and the most important things that families can do is to plan on how to get that degree. At Sallie Mae, we have a tool called the Education Investment Planner. It allows families to go in and actually has the exact colleges, you know, GW and Vanderbilt and University of Maryland, and you put in your college and you can put in your award letters, and it will, and then you work with it to put in how much as a family are we going to pay from income and savings, how much do we have, how much, what's our award letter look like, and then it tells you how much you're going to have to borrow to pay for the full cost of college. At the end of the process, you go through this process, you get a summary sheet that tells you this is how much you're going to borrow to get your degree, and what's your expected income, and it gives you a green light, yellow light, red light on your monthly payments. And it is, you know, you're getting that red light, you need to go back to the beginning and figure out, be that cost-conscious person. The problem with that, and it's a great tool, let me tell you, it's a great tool. The problem with it is that people don't finish it. They go in, they don't finish it. It's hard to, it's kind of scary. And and by the time that people are using that tool, they've already decided. You know, the students, one of the things in the survey is that we ask people who decided on college. Well, the student decides. They get their hearts set, and then families decide they're willing to stretch to do that. And then they make college a decision 1 year at a time, right? We'll get through this year, and then we'll figure out next year. And that, you know, that can work, but it also can lead to debt without the real benefit of the education. So I think one of the challenges is how to get families and students early on in the process in financial literacy thinking about how they're going to pay for college, what kind of choices that they have, to be able to look at the full cost of getting a degree, which is scary. It certainly is. But families have to look at that in order to be successful, because that's the most important thing. We have lots of information out there. I mean, there's net calculators and there's all sorts of things to confuse people, but it's really being able to think about how can we be successful in making this such important investment. It's such a valuable investment, right? So that is my prepared, well, slightly prepared remarks.
Hi, I'm Dave Rogowski from Social Security Administration. I was just, for this planning purposes, when do you get them to plan? Like at Social Security, they had us come in when we were, like when we're, even before, as part of our employment, talking about 529 plans for Maryland. I mean, does Sallie Mae go around like the states and start talking about it?
Well,
I mean, they do that like when you're in your 20s at Social Security.
you know, I think so we build tools for families to use, and we are managing a lot of college savings plans. So we're promoting college savings all along, and we actually, I had hoped that we'd have finished, but we don't. We actually do a survey on how America saves for college as well, and you know, families are aware of it. I just think they need to have more tools available to them. I just don't think they do have tools available to them and the kind of choices that they need to make. But it is, I think with the stories out there that people are becoming more aware of college costs, and I just think we need to figure out ways to make better tools for people to be able to look at schools, look at the investment, look at whether the investment is worth it. You know, is it worth it to borrow for that degree? I think we need to have better income data as to what degrees, you know, is it worth it to borrow for an art degree, or is it worth it to borrow an engineering? They're very different degrees. They're great degrees, both of them. I'm not ranking any of them, but you have to make a different choice, even not just by school, but by degree. Families need to approach it as an investment, and whether they're going to be able to manage that investment over time.
Hi, my name is Daryl Getter from the Congressional Research Service, and I
Hi, Daryl.
How you doing? We'll talk later. But I appreciate the demand side presentation, but I have a supply side question for you. Can you tell me just a little bit about how student loans are underwritten in terms of what factors go into an algorithm that would say whether or not you get a student loan, how much it would be, and who would get rejected for a student loan?
Okay, so for 85, 90%, well, 90% of all new student loans, they're not underwritten, right? Federal student loans are not underwritten. They are provided based on you going to a Title IV eligible school, and you're going more than part-time, and you're provided up to a loan limit depending on your status, your year in school, whether you're a dependent student or an independent student, whether you're an undergraduate or graduate. So the only loan program that has some credit underwriting in the federal program is the Parent Plus program, and that doesn't have any. It doesn't have underwriting in terms of ability to repay. It has a check on whether you have an adverse credit. So if you're a parent going to school, you can borrow between available aid and the total cost of attendance, and the check on that is whether you're really in collections or you've had a bankruptcy, a default, some bad event on your credit bureau, then you're not going to be able to get that loan. But other than that, it's overall access. Private lenders without federal backing, so what Simon does, we have our own proprietary model, but we assess a borrower's ability and willingness to repay. So it's a small market, it's targeted to well-qualified borrowers. Frequently, not always, but frequently there's a co-borrower, most often the parent. And that actually, having a co-borrower can bring down the interest rate on the loan, a well-qualified parent. So that's the market is not gigantic, as I said earlier. The purely private lender education market is about $6.5 billion last year. Because we underwrite those loans, right. Anybody else?
So first of all, it's very interesting to see that families use a variety of methods to support educations, but this seems to be different also across income groups. And I'm actually thinking of this in the area of financial literacy. I like your idea where you said, they have to think about this as an investment, right? But we ask people to make this decision very early on, for example, for the children that come with a family, perhaps with low education. And those people have to bear the brunt, right, of their college cost. So, I'm just thinking of ways in which this can be promoted. And I'm actually just thinking that perhaps having financial literacy in high school is critically important, because that's, perhaps one of the important way in which people can understand this decision and maybe prepare, even though it seems to be not maybe too late, but for that.
Yeah, I completely agree that financial literacy needs to be done at the high school level, so that students can know what they're planning for, and they know what a loan is. I mean, I think one of the it's pretty easy to get a federal loan. So you get you have to fill out the FAFSA, but which is easier than it used to be, but it's not that easy. But loans are packaged as part of an award letter, and sometimes PLUS loans are packaged. So the federal government is saying it's okay for you to take out this loan, when in fact you really ought to think about, should I take out this loan or not? I mean, lots of times it's the right thing to do, but it really depends on the individual, I think, and that's and how do you teach families and students, young students, they're going to college making this investment. They're 18-year-olds making this investment. How do you make that investment? How do you make it wisely? They need tools and assistance in that, I think, for sure. Yeah, Jean.
So Jean Hogarth, Federal Reserve. Are your numbers self-reported numbers, or are they backed with administrative data?
No, this is a survey. So we ask families how much they're spending. We kick out the crazy numbers, like I spent $1 million. We don't include that in our averages. But these are there is no way to get to how much families spend from income unless you ask them. So we have, you know, that's just,
How about their income? Are you matching the IRS W-2?
no, we don't, no, we ask, no, in terms of how much they're spending from their income.
Their actual income. Because people,
Well,
what
it-
we've learned is people who are low income typically over-report, and people who are high income typically under-report their income. And that's just a fact. That's just, I think everything Anna and the senators are showing, that's just what people do.
Yeah, so what we end up with is pretty, we don't get very granular on this. We have big, broad, 0 to 35,000, 35,000, 35 to $100,000. We used to go a little more granular, and that didn't make sense. So middle income is 35 to 100, so it's pretty broad. But it is, you know, there is no way to say, we can get data from what people are getting on Pell Grants, we can get data on what people are borrowing, but you can't really get the full picture unless you go out and actually ask them what they're spending.
I would just sort of share with you that we did a pilot study with Iowa State University where we matched student reports of what they owed with the financial aid office report of what they actually owed. And about 2 out of 5 students were off by at least $5,000 in the wrong way, sadly.
Yeah, I think that would be that is too bad. That is, maybe with the discussion on debt and student loans, I think people are becoming more aware of what they're getting. And we actually, this year in aggregate, we saw a leveling off of federal student loans even. So that's probably good. That's driven really by a sector, I think. There is a big contraction in the for-profit sector, and so it probably masks some of the other changes that are going on there. But if there was another way to do it, we'd do it another way. But I think importantly, we've done it the same way. We actually had to make the reason we only have 4 years of dollar data is that the first year, we had to make a few adjustments in the second year to make sure we captured everybody, because we could tell we were missing some data on the dollar numbers. So we have 4 years. And so I think it's important, listen, they're going to make a mistake, they're going to make a mistake the same way every year, so we can get trends. The precise dollar number isn't as important as the movement. And so we can get a sense of how families are adjusting and making changes to be able to pay these bills. So. Yes, yes, yes.
You can at least try to calculate, how much was the origination for that year. So you can kind of calculate, given those answers, if you get to the total or you are close to that.
Yeah, so we can look at average borrowing and that looks about the same, within a margin of error. The average borrowing from federal loans, you can get that publicly. So we line that up. We can't get it. We can get plus. That's pretty easy, right? We can get plus, and that lines up pretty well. Undergrad average borrowing is a little harder because our population is probably going to be largely dependent students. So, you have to do that. But we do the checks on, the overall data to see if it makes sense. Mm-hmm. And it generally makes sense. So, it generally lines up. It's not perfect, but it's within a reasonable range. And again, it's really the trends overall, what we're seeing is what we want to stress. I think.
I'm Catherine Sider from Treasury. I'm just curious to go back, talk about the kind of tools that people might use someday to make better decisions about this. I'm curious what your thoughts are about when we should be using those tools. Because I think a lot of people talk about, well, maybe we should use them when people are filling out the FAFSA. But I think maybe it's too late at that point. And so, I don't know, just kind of curious to hear what you have to say about that, or when we should be using those tools and what the kind of information they might share.
Yeah, so FAFSA, you fill out January, right? You've already decided where you're applying. You've already applied, then you fill out the FAFSA, which is, but you have to do it that way because otherwise you don't have good data. So I think it's really the earlier the better, right? I mean, the earlier families can start to think about this and start to talk to students about what's realistic and what they can afford, and to put those bounds on there. I mean, it feels like in our survey that families are starting to put bounds on. We're going to make this investment, but here, you know, so students are making the choice, but they're being more cost conscious, and the parents are being more cost conscious. So within this group, we're going to be more cost conscious. But I think there has to be financial literacy tools available earlier in high school when families need it, and it really needs to be junior, junior year. If you haven't really started to think about that, that's because junior year is when people are making their choices. And you know, really a lot of, you know, that's sort of the traditional path, but what we see here is there isn't a traditional path. And you know, we know students come out of high school and then say, well, I want to go on to college. I didn't get it, and so they go to an open enrollment place and then borrow for that as well. So they need that tool as well, right? I mean, it needs to be available early, broadly. You know, Sally, our tool is great, but it's on our website. It needs to be something that's available broadly to anyone who can get to it and to look at. And it really is, do you want to get an associate's degree? This is what you're going to get out of it, and this is what your prospects are for that degree. Does it make sense? You know, there's great income research done. I think Georgetown has done some good income research that could be tied into that kind of model. Getting a bachelor's degree, here's the program I'm going to do, tie income into that, whether it makes sense. Because families also kind of overestimate the immediate impact of a college education as well. They, you know, over time, they have a good idea of what it means in income, but initially, they probably are overestimating what it means. And so so I think earlier is always better, and it needs to be broadly available. Way in the back.
Hi, I'm Barbara Smith with the Social Security Administration. How have you reached out to make sure that these results are more widely known, so that families know them earlier?
Well, I'm surprised you didn't read about this earlier. we publicize this broadly. I mean, we try to get this into every media circle that we can, and we had extensive coverage in July. We pulled up our release this year because we thought it was so important in this conversation. We pulled up our release from August. And it was always August, not because that's a good time to release it, but just because when we could get it done. So we killed ourselves to get it done in July this year. Yeah, we really did. And it was hard. But it actually was a great time to release it, and we got coverage everywhere in terms of, it went out on the wire service, we had radio interviews, we've been on Univision. I haven't, but because I don't speak Spanish, but we were on Univision talking about it. So we talk about it everywhere we go. We talk about it at colleges and universities. Our sales, the people that works with colleges and universities go out and talk about it with colleges and universities, financial aid offices, to make them aware of that. They like this research. It reaffirms what they're seeing as well, I think. So we've gotten a good reception there. But you know, there's only one of me. So and we got a few issues in student loans that require other time. So we don't get out probably as much as we'd like. But I think it's, you know, things like this and people using it and putting it on their website and citing it, it makes it more available to more families. I think it's great.
I would like to continue on that and kind of merge in the two questions that were asked here, which is really important, which is, you know, how can your study really be used to help family pay for college? And, you know, this planning seems to be critically important, and even the high-income family, as we see here, do not do it. So, like, can you kind of elaborate and maybe kind of, you know, we also need to think a little bit more. Hello Wallet, I think you have some work to do there as well, you know, about how this planning right, needs to be done, and how can we make it happen, early on?
Yeah, I'll take any publicity I can get on this research because I think more families that can. So we really publish this more for policymakers and for informing people on how people pay for college. But the more we think about it, it can be a financial literacy tool as well. That if we can get a broader distribution to families, these are parents and students that are going through the college process today and how they're meeting those bills. I think high school and before families can look at it and say, this is what I can expect. This is grants and scholarships are by and large not going to pay for my whole college. Free ride, full ride's great, but not probably going to happen. So I should be thinking about how much of my income and savings I can set aside, how much we're willing to borrow. They can use the tool to sort of look at all the resources that people draw on and whether those are resources they think they can draw on. And then the other thing is really driving home is having a plan, is thinking about it and developing a plan and being realistic about it. And I think the more we can talk about it, the more publicity we can get on it, people can look at it and use it in that way as a financial literacy tool.
Treasurers, like Peter Franconi in Maryland's done a lot with this issue. I mean, just reach out to the state treasurers because then they can reach out to the school boards.
That's a terrific idea. It's a terrific idea. I mean, we do work with some state treasurers on we have a number of 529 plans that we work with treasurer's office, but again, we don't have that. We're not as big as we used to be.
Hi, so looking at it from the other perspective, let's say you didn't plan. You have a student loan. You're one of the millions of people who's trying to pay it back. Are you guys looking at tools within the Sallie Mae experience for people who are in repayment mode to make sure that they don't default and they don't make other bad decisions? Because now that they have that loan and they have to pay it back, maybe they'll be more engaged in trying to stay on track, and maybe that's the point where they might use some of these tools.
So, right, well, once you have the loan, you're not going to use the education investment planner anymore. But this is what we've done for decades, right? Is to work with students who are coming out of school to manage that process. This economic period has been particularly challenging, obviously. The thing that's most important to us is communications, and we need to talk to borrowers that are struggling, that are distressed. They need to call us, they need to talk to us, they need to work with us, because otherwise we can't do anything for them. We have tools that are both, we have federal tools and then we have our own private education loan tools. On the federal program, we work sort of tiered-wise, right? We have repayment programs that they can access. There's income-based repayment. New plan was announced today on income-based repayment. That is the first place we go. The process is going to get streamlined. It'll be easier than it was. It wasn't always that easy to do. It has to be renewed every year. We look to see if they're eligible for any deferments or any, particularly where the interest is paid. And then you work down the waterfall of what's available to them. I mean, at the last resort, we'll use a forbearance to keep them out of default. But we can work with federal borrowers. On our private loans, we do work very closely with those borrowers as well. And that's more. And it's a budgeting process, right? You work through with those borrowers. How much are you able to pay? Our goal for any product, but particularly our private education loans, is to keep borrowers in repayment, because once you stop that practice of repayment, it's very difficult to get back on. And if you're not paying, you're just building up the balance, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So we don't think that using forbearance broadly is the best idea. It is definitely useful in circumstances, but it is not useful for every borrower. probably are not aware that we have a rate reduction program for our distressed borrowers, someone who is actually struggling and unable to make payments and has demonstrated that. We will work with them, and if we can keep them in monthly payment, we will reduce their interest rate down to 1%, just to keep them in repayment. We have modified $1.1 billion worth of loans through this program. Borrowers in it for a year, we reassess them after the year, get them back into repayment. So we work on these tools all the time. We work through challenges in terms of the economy. Again, it's that mismatch, right? Students coming out of school may not get the full value of the education right away. I don't know about you, I graduated from college, I was a secretary for a couple of years, so I probably wasn't earning my income potential either. But so it's managing that mismatch to make sure that they are able to manage their obligations, accrue the value of their investment, and be able to pay off their loan at the end of the time. It's in our interest that they do that. It is never, it sounds trite, it is never in our interest to have a student default, a borrower default. It is not in their interest, it's not in our interest. It's where we're perfectly aligned. We want to keep a borrower in repayment.